So, I mean, first of all, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me,
Totally.
even though I'm the devil. And you might also become the devil just through the contagion of speaking to devilish people.
Yeah, devilhood is very contagious.
Yeah, the devil disease. I guess, I mean, the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about, just because it's probably been, I'm assuming it's been the most controversial thing that you've covered and has been the source of lots of harassment and attacks online, et cetera, is the work that you've done around trans kids and gender dysphoria. So I guess I wonder, I mean, how did you first become interested in this particular issue?
Yeah, I read, this would have been 2015 or so. I read Alice Drager's excellent book, Galileo's Middle Finger. And it basically covers a bunch of different case studies of these really fierce fights between science and activists. And I think that's sometimes a bit of a false dichotomy, but I think it fairly captures what happened here. And Drager just sort of runs down these cases in clinical forensic detail, and she shows how, some scientists have really had people attempt to ruin their reputations and careers because they sort of go against certain sacred principles or sacred principles at the time. One of those cases involved gender dysphoria, and I think that first got me interested in the subject. And from there, maybe a few months after that, I did sort of a book review essay of it for New York Magazine's website. I got word that this clinic in Toronto had been shut down. And when I read the sort of document that justified it being shutting down on the grounds that they were hurting kids and maybe doing conversion therapy, this was a clinic where, kids with gender questions would go to for treatment and sometimes for puberty blockers and hormones. But anyone who read this document would have seen there's something really wrong about it. It was just very unprofessionally done, and it raised a lot of questions about what the process was like. So, I looked into it, and I was able to find that the single biggest charge against this doctor, Ken Zucker, that he had made a cruel comment to a kid about his body, was totally false. The person, now an adult, had misremembered. It had been done by another doctor, and other parts of the story sort of fell apart too. So I think because I was seen as someone, quote unquote, defending conversion therapy, from then on, there was a group of people who sort of didn't trust me. But it's sort of the same as with the Drager's book, where if you read Drager's book and your key point is who is exactly right about these controversies versus how should we handle disagreement and what's a fair versus an unfair attack, I think that's the wrong approach. Now, I don't think what Zucker did, based on the evidence I found, constituted conversion therapy. I found no evidence of any kid who had socially transitioned who he sort of forced into the other box. I do think his treatments were probably more conservative with regard to social transition than what's going on these days. And I think, if you think that's bad or harmful, people should make that argument. But what struck me in the years since then is that people keep repeating certain claims about the clinic as though they've been proven when a lot of them are just false. So I think that was sort of my first taste of tension between my job as a journalist and sort of my status as someone about to sneeze, sorry, as someone as someone seen as in good stead with social justice activist types. And I really think we need to carve out a space for journalists trying to do their job well to sometimes come up with answers that go against, certain strongly held ideas, because in much the same way scientists are often wrong about things, sometimes social justice activists are wrong about things. And I think with regard to some of the claims they made about Zucker, they were wrong. And years later, no one has showed me anything wrong with my reporting. And Zucker won several $100,000, I think, a few months ago in a settlement where the hospital that shut down the clinic acknowledged some level of wrongdoing. So, there's things I do different about that story, but the reporting, in my view, has been vindicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, what's weird, and this seems to be like a broader trend, but this is a really good example, is that it seems like despite reporting or despite sometimes claims and smears being disproven, people still want to run with the smears and the claims. So, I've read your piece on Zucker, and it's a really good piece. It's really good reporting. it demonstrates. I mean, Ken Zucker isn't even opposed to, you know, transitioning kids necessarily. He just takes, yeah, like you said, a more conservative approach. So he's not immediately just going to put a kid on hormones and on a path towards transition just because they believe they have gender dysphoria or they believe they are the opposite sex or whatever it is. You know, he sort of takes a wait and see approach more so than others, you know, trans activists might like. But you know, he's still, those smears are still kind of around. Like, they haven't gone away despite the fact that what's been said about him has been disproven.
Yeah, I think the last sort of online trouble I got in before I got into this stuff involved Gamergate and sort of far right / alt right adjacent people like Mike Cernovich and Candace Owens. And that was my first experience with like communities that just don't handle rumor well and where rumors about perceived enemies never get debunked. And that was also the first time I sort of had people just, you know, make up potentially professionally damaging stuff about me just to go after me. And, you know, I remember I got sort of obsessive about Gamergate. I would hang out, not like interact with, but I would watch their subreddit, which they called Kotaku in Action. I would watch in real time as they generated new rumors about their enemies, about Zoe Quinn or Brianna Wu. If you're watching this, you don't know who I'm talking about, that's good. Like, don't look into it. And sometimes I would pop up there. They would decide that I was secretly allied with or romantically involved with some figure they hated. And it was just sort of mind-blowing watching these rumors take off. And there was very little incentive within these Gamergate communities to be the person who stands up and says, like, guys, we don't really have evidence for that. Like, there were a few of them, but the overwhelming social incentives were toward snowballing the rumors and sort of who could say the most bad claim about whoever they didn't like. So I think I attributed a lot of those tendencies to conservative and reactionary communities. And until I got involved writing about gender dysphoria, you know, this is all just human nature. I think ideological communities or communities forged by trauma or hardship or grievance are really susceptible to passing around bad information. And it's been interesting sort of watching communities on both sides, as it were, do that about me, sort of becoming sometimes a little bit too much, becoming the subject of the stuff I write about.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so do you think that it's connected particularly to online culture or the way that we communicate online, you know, the way that everything's sort of public and immediate? I mean, you said that you felt like it was sort of just inherent to these kinds of communities and people who are, I don't know, maybe particularly attached to their ideologies.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, Twitter factors in.
Yeah, I think maybe the way to look at it is that social media turbocharges certain aspects of human nature and sort of dampens others because, you know, humans do have the capacity to sort of cool off and think things through and discuss. Even people who disagree horribly can discuss things. Twitter tends to push people in the other direction, and Twitter is more and more where journalists and editors and activists hang out. And it's also, you know, for a lot of people who are dealing with genuine trauma and oppression in their lives, if they have access to the internet, that's sort of where they hang out and that's where they find community, which is good. But yeah, it turbocharges some of the worst parts of our human nature. So you have the combination of one of those groups I mentioned that's either very ideological, very trauma forged, very grievance focused, plus the internet. It just gets really toxic. And I think that's why certain communities end up being a little bit worse than others on the rumor front.
Mm-hmm. So, and you've also done some specific work around trans kids and detransitioners, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what did you find in your reporting?
Yeah. So if you, people who sort of want to learn a lot more about this, I tried to write on this black whiteboard here. I think I tried to write it backwards so it would show up. You probably can't see it. My newsletter is
to me, but
oh yeah, no, but no.
Maybe it'll work out in the end product.
jessesingal.substack.com.
Okay.
That would be hilarious if I messed up something that simple. Anyway, desistance is this phenomenon where kids who have gender dysphoria, it sort of goes away on its own sometimes. And the idea is that as kids grow and develop, their sense of their identity changes. All of our senses of our identities change. And there's stuff you feel strongly about at age 5, you don't feel about at 10 or 10 to 15, blah, blah, blah. Pretty well-founded idea that for a good chunk of kids, and I think people have overestimated how many. I used to say 80% of kids. I don't think it's that high. A good number of kids with gender dysphoria at 5 will no longer have it at 10. And what I did in my most recent post is I looked at these studies very closely, and I looked at criticisms of them. And it doesn't matter how you poke them, how you prod them, what angle you look at them, you always come away with the same idea. This is a real thing that happens. And what that means is, parents who have a 5-year-old kid with gender dysphoria, they should be aware that there's a chance that in time it will go away. It doesn't mean it definitely will. And I don't think individual parents should ever be sure about the developmental path their kid will take. But I found a disturbing degree in left of center spaces of what I would really call science denialism about this. Of instead of saying these studies might have had certain flaws that overestimate the rate of desistance, people just say we should throw them all out. They're fatally flawed. But the point of the work I did this week in my newsletter was to sort of try to argue very specifically why that's too strong a conclusion. I don't think these studies are perfect. I do think desistance is real. And I've also, whenever I've looked for desisters, they've been really easy to find, which is what the literature would suggest. So, you got to treat kids as individuals, and you got to give them room to explore, and you should never punish them or shame them for gender nonconforming behavior. But you should also recognize that identity is fluid, and there's really pseudoscientific claims circulating because they're seen as pro-trans that, for example, everyone's born with a stable gender identity or everyone knows exactly who they are by age 5. That's all completely false. There's really no evidence to support that. There's some evidence that as we grow up, we get a little bit less gender fluid. And there's some evidence that the more gender dysphoric a 5-year-old is, the less likely they'll desist. But these are all, my mic almost fell. These are all just sort of correlations. And you just, there's just so much misinformation about this on all sides, and all that I want is for journalists to report on it a bit more accurately and responsibly, which, I did the most important part first. The reason I wrote about this stuff this week is Science Versus, which is a Gimlet podcast with 500,000 listeners. They did an episode on this stuff where they got 2 things very, very wrong, and they accidentally fabricated an entire study result which would suggest desistance almost never happens. So when you have a podcast whose literally only job and sort of pitch is like, we cut through the noise to show people what the real science is, when a podcast like that not only doesn't get this stuff right, but gets it exactly 180 degrees wrong, to me, that's sort of a canary in the coal mine moment, that the science reporting on this is not good.
Obviously, I'm critical of the idea of gender identity itself. Do you think that, and even the idea of gender dysphoria, like I'm sort of not really clear on what that means, so I'm skeptical as to, it's not that I don't believe that there are some people in the world who really believe that they should be the opposite sex, or they really are the opposite sex. I think probably most people who are identifying as trans these days don't necessarily fit into that category, and I'm not exactly sure how we measure that. Maybe you know more, but do you do you buy into the idea of gender dysphoria? Like, are there actually people who have gender dysphoria, and what does that mean?
Yeah, I definitely, I agree with you on gender identity, that I think there's sort of conceptually backbreaking problems with, not just with the concept, because, okay, so if you just said gender identity is what it's like to feel like a woman, you could sort of say, okay, whatever, that means something different to everyone. It's probably stereotypical, but, I can sort of get what it means. The problem is it's now sort of seen as a basis of this whole rights movement, and something that conceptually fuzzy, it's just not a good idea.
Oops, I just lost you. There you are.
Oh, you got me back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Anyway, gender identity, I agree, is fuzzy. I think gender dysphoria, I think it's definitely real. And I think there's a subset of people who often basically from birth feel such distress at the sexed aspects of their body and as being seen as male or female I think for some of them, they're just not going to live a good, authentic life if they're forced to do that. And I think there's a real moral imperative to give them access to transition resources. So I'm really convinced about that. And that I found when I talk about this stuff with conservatives or with people who are skeptical of this whole idea, people can understand that. They can understand what it would feel like to have this sort of deep sense of distress. And I think especially women, because I think a lot of women might experience a version of gender dysphoria or something like it that isn't quite as much as feeling you are a man or want to be a man, especially around puberty. Like I know a lot of women who have told me puberty just sucks. And the first time you get catcalled or ogled.
Yeah, I
But I
mean,
don't,
all of a sudden you start developing like a body that is, an adult woman's body, and so
yeah,
men start looking at you and saying disgusting things to you, and so it's sort of natural to me that a lot of young women would be like, I don't want these body parts, like I don't want to look like this doesn't feel good.
yeah. And I view that as sort of like a cousin to gender dysphoria, but I can only sort of understand this by what other people have said. I view it as like that, but sort of worse and more intense and more relentless. And I do think there's a risk of girls who just go through normal puberty stuff being misdiagnosed. That's why I wrote my long Atlantic piece. But yeah, when I read about kids who at the age of 2, there really are kids who from the age of 2 or 3 or whenever they're talking much say things like, I'm not supposed to have a penis, or why did God make me a boy or a girl? And my view is not we should sort of instantly socially transition them and assume that the gender dysphoria is never going to go away. Because I think even in some of their cases it does. But I think it points to some biological component here that whether or not you want to call it hardwired, whatever, it's a really deep part of them. And I don't think there's really any other explanation for it than that. Even if I don't think we all have an innate gender identity.
Yeah, and I mean, in those kinds of situations where people are distressed for a long period of time about their sex body, I mean, I'm not going to try to stop somebody from getting a surgery if that's going to make them feel better and happier in their life, for sure. Obviously, I think we need to be cautious about that, and like I still believe that it's not possible to change sex, but again, yeah, I'm not going to oppose if somebody wants to take hormones and they want to get surgeries and whatever to live what they feel is an authentic life, then of course I'm not going to try to stop them.
Yeah.
I mean, so you've gotten flack from trans activists, obviously. I think you've also gotten some flack from feminists, partly around, I mean, you can tell me if I'm missing some things, but I think partly around the issue of pronouns, and then partly around the word TERF, which obviously, I mean, feminists who are critical of the idea of gender identity and gender identity legislation see the word TERF as a smear, and so take issue with people using it as though, and like nobody identifies as a TERF, right?
Right.
Like I don't identify as a feminist.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I wonder, I mean, I guess I wonder what you think about that term. I wonder what you think about the pronouns issue. And I also wonder what you feel about the maybe angry response from feminists over your positions on those things. Or I don't know if you still use the word TERF or whatever, what you think about that term.
Yeah, I think turf is so non-specific at this point, and it's like I think one time someone said that I had blown a turf dog whistle because I said something like, "No one's denying that biological sex exists." So if we're at the point where acknowledging biological sex exists is a turf dog whistle, I don't know what to tell you. It's sort of like the left-wing version of like, if you want to increase the top tax rate a little bit, you want socialism. It's just such a sort of everything's whatever I don't like is evil. I've never fully bought the idea that because you yourself don't identify as a turf, it's either unfair or meaningless. Because like there's a subset of people, I'm not comparing turfs and racists, I'm making sort of a philosophy of language point here. There's a subset of people who are called racist. Some of them are actually racist. They don't. What if one of them said, "Well, that's just a slur. I don't identify as a racist." Again, I'm setting aside your particular situation. I'm just not sure the argument holds together that because I don't identify as something, you can't call me it, right? Or am I misunderstanding?
No, that's fair enough. I mean, I guess it's ironic because, so for example, I use the term trans-identified male to refer to trans women.
Yeah.
For most of the time, not all the time. Sometimes I say trans woman. But And because I think that's more accurate and specific, but of course, people who identify as trans women don't use the term trans identified male. So I don't know that I would support that either. I think mostly I just find it ironic because the people who tend to call me a TERF or call the feminists that I know TERFs are people who insist that we respect their identities as they insist, and then they're applying this term, which is used in the pejorative almost all the time, that we consider a slur, and that is so often attached to like threats of violence and smears and blah blah blah. And I mean, I mostly oppose it because I don't feel it accurately describes my position. But well, I mean, it's not a nice word. Like, it's not a kind word for the most part. I mean, some people might use it in a neutral way, but I think most people don't.
Yeah, I guess. Okay, so I mean, there's a lot to unpack because technically speaking, if the assumption is trans women should be included with sort of natal women in all things, you disagree with that. You think they should be excluded from some things, right?
But not because of the trans identity, because they're male. So we don't exclude trans identified females from women's spaces. So it's trans exclusionary. It's like, well, if we're talking, I mean, are we talking about spaces? Are we talking about excluding people from feminism?
Right.
If we're talking about spaces, like, yeah, any female, whether they identify as trans or non-binary or whatever, is welcome into women's spaces as far as feminists are concerned. It's the issue of males, and it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the trans identity, because I mean, feminists who are critical of these ideas don't really differentiate between males and trans women. So it's just it's like a totally different perspective.
But if you, just to push on that, like if you were at a feminist meetup or a book club or something, and a post-transition trans man who passed and looked like a man and had secondary sex characteristics of a man because he was on hormones. I don't know. Would you really accept him just because he's female in the sense of having been born that way?
I mean, personally, I probably would. Yes, I can't speak on behalf of other feminists, so I don't know actually what they would say about that question. Yeah. And I mean, I guess it's tough when you do start drawing lines, and it's like, who counts and who doesn't count.
Yeah.
And partly, I mean, which ties into part of the issue that I have with trans ideology and this gender identity legislation, is that we've started to push the idea, and we've started to push laws and policy that are based only on self-identification. So there's not actually any requirement for surgery and hormones. Not that I'm necessarily saying, oh, for you to count as a real trans woman, you have to have surgery and you have to have hormones.
Right.
But at least it would be easier to have that discussion if we knew who we were talking about and who was part of this group and who we were categorizing in this way. But as it stands now, we're talking about really anyone at all, because
I think basically, in my view, what happens is because all of this is always litigated, but not really litigated, by screaming at one another online. I'm not blaming you for that, because you've gotten screamed at plenty. The kinds of conversations you could have offline, where if I sat down with a trans activist and I said, do you really think if LeBron James came out as a trans woman tomorrow and didn't go on hormones, that he should then play in the NBA because he's really a woman? I don't think anybody actually believes that. I think that online there's such a bunker mentality, and so many trans people really have had trouble accessing services or being seen a way that it's really important to them that they be seen, that everything just becomes a fight. And it feels like if you give an inch, people are going to use that inch to hurt you. So that's why I just sort of I wish there was more of an open conversation, or like this stuff going on with sports. I think some social justice people are shooting themselves in the foot by thinking that you can just sort of, not talk about what are in some cases like pretty big differences in how we categorize people. And I think what I've been trying to argue is that I think 90% of the time it's sort of fine, and we can treat people as they want to be treated, and it's not asking anything of anyone. But I think the people who are against transition and conservatives, they're going to focus on things like sports and prisons where biological sex clearly matters in these cases, and you can't pretend it isn't real. But if you can't sort of sit down and talk about this stuff in detail with a little bit of nuance, you can't work this stuff out, and it's going to require working out. It's not like, it's a little bit different from the gay rights fight where really all you had to do was stop treating gay people poorly. Like it is, you're taking certain things where you used to categorize people by sex, and now you're categorizing them by gender identity.
Right.
And that is different.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I mean, and
No,
it's not, and of course people do treat trans-identified people poorly, but in this case it's not really all about treating people poorly, and especially for feminists, we're like, well, we're trying to defend women's rights, and the sports issue is obviously a really big one because it just is so unfair for somebody with a male body to be able to compete against women. And so it's frustrating when those kinds of arguments are framed as phobic or hateful or being mean or something, because it's like, well, we're not trying to be mean to you, but we also have to stand up for ourselves at the same time.
Look, I do agree with that. And I think I remember some British publication got in trouble because someone posited that there's actually some competing rights at work here.
Yeah.
That in itself, claiming that this is in certain senses zero sum, was seen as bigoted. But I think everybody knows that in some cases there are competing rights, simply because, as I said, like, you used to categorize people this way, you're saying we should shift it to this way. It's different, and there might be pros and cons, and you need to be able to talk about that. And the idea that simply raising the possibility that sometimes you're going to divide people up by biological sex, and in my view, where we might differ is, like, I don't think there's that many where you need to strictly monitor people's biological sex. I don't think you need to do that in bathroom settings. I don't think you need to do that in day-to-day life. I think there's a small set which are now going to become flashpoints with things like sports and prisons. And yeah, I just don't think it helps anyone to act like it's sort of this weird, like, and people overuse the term gaslighting, but to act like biological sex was never a meaningful way to divide people when, not long ago, feminists were arguing the exact opposite for, like, their own facilities and sports teams and stuff. The argument's just such a mess right now, and I don't really have any hope of it getting better. And I think there's a chance it's just going to generate a lot of backlash that hurts everyone involved.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to the places where I think it's important to divide based on biological sex to places like transition houses for women escaping male violence. Like here in Vancouver, we have a transition house and rape crisis center that is women only, and they just are constantly under attack for that policy. And I do think it's important when women are escaping that kind of violence that they do have a space that there aren't men in. And then also places like change rooms where there's girls and women and they wouldn't want to see a naked adult man in there. But I mean, anyway, we can move on from this. I guess, did you want to talk about the issue of pronouns and why? We don't have to, but...
No, I mean, my view is just, I as a practice, if people say they want me to use a pronoun, I use it. And that's partly because I don't attach that much to pronouns. Like, I don't think when people, again, I guess it's because I don't have gender dysphoria, but, like, I don't think when people call me he, it has certain cultural connotations to it, but I sort of view it as an accident. Like, because I'm viewed as male, and that's what males are called. So I just feel like if the vast majority of people who make that request are making it for a reason that's important, and I don't see a reason not to recognize it. I also think that, like, if you spend too much time on Tumblr or you hang out with a lot of, like, radical college types, there's obviously some people, like with any other social change, who sort of just are a dick about it. A very good pro-trans clinician I once interviewed said something like, teenagers can be assholes sometimes. So there's obviously some cases where you would roll your eyes a little bit, but I mean, where we might differ is, like, I take it you think you are sort of giving something up or misrepresenting the world by using a different pronoun?
Yeah, and it's one thing, because a lot of people will say, like, oh, okay, well, if you had a friend who identified as a trans woman, would you use female pronouns, like when you were having a conversation with that person? And I think, of course, I would. I think that if I was one-on-one with somebody, there's not really any reason for me to insist on using he. I think that when I'm speaking in a public context and in a political context, that does change. And so that's part of the reason why I use, like, I just don't want to go, I do consider it like a form of gaslighting. I don't want to go along with the idea that a man can announce that he's a woman and literally be a woman. And I also, like, it ends up feeling really bullying, like the way that people behave online, in particular around pronouns, and accusing people of hate speech and hate crimes because they use the wrong pronoun. I mean, this is why I was kicked off of Twitter, right? For using the word he to describe a male who still uses his male name on social media and everywhere else.
That was the Yaniv thing,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. So
that was weird because they, whatever pronoun they're using, they themselves use both pronouns online. I still don't understand how that led. That was really it for you getting kicked off Twitter?
Yeah, that was the one thing. Like, my account had been temporarily locked a couple of times for saying men aren't women, and for saying how are trans women not men, which was like a philosophical question. Like, it wasn't an attack. It was like, okay, in what way is a trans woman not a man? Like, you know, how does one go from being a man to a woman? But anyway, the tweet that actually got me permanently banned was only that one about Yaniv and he, and I'm assuming it's the misgendering. I mean, Twitter never told me, right? They just said hateful conduct, bye. And I was like, but yeah, like, so that it gets taken too far. So I don't want to, I'm not willing to give any leeway on that. And it really frustrates me when I see media reports about violent men or sexual predators who've, like, you know, gotten out of prison and have decided now they're going to transition, and now they're reporting on this male violence against women or girls as though this person is a woman, and don't even mention that this person identifies as trans, don't mention that they're male. Like, I think that there's a danger of skewing statistics in terms of male violence and things like that.
I think my stance is just, like, in the same way, there's some edge cases that might be important where, like, I would go against my usual rule. It's the same thing here. Like, yeah, if someone as a male commits acts of violence and then transitions, they clearly, when they commit those acts, they're male. And for certain categorization purposes, yeah. It's just one of those things where there's such a weird filter bubble online that, like, I don't know, if you brought that scenario to most Canadians or Americans, what percentage would say, yeah, because they transitioned, they were always a woman and committed murder as a woman? And again, this is a weird, you know, this is an unusual situation, though I know it's happened like a couple times. I think there's something about spending too much time online that just completely warps your perception of what people think. It's like a real pluralistic ignorance thing, because you go on Twitter and fairly reasonable views just get shouted down so vehemently.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been doing some events about this lately, and the conversation, like the Q&A, always goes really well. Like, there's usually not really that much hostility, and people are generally, like, pretty respectful, and it's just, like, so different than what plays out online, which is, like, crazy threats and crazy smears and crazy attacks. And, you know, I do wish that we would I'm glad that we're starting to have this conversation in real life, because it really makes a really big difference when you have to see someone's face and actually talk to them.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on from this gender identity stuff, because I wanted to talk to you about this issue that you've covered a bunch, which is pretty weird and probably sounds weird to anyone who hasn't really followed it, which is this, like, young adult fiction huge feud online. Like, it sounds like such a weird place for there to be a giant feud, like, in the young adult fiction world. So what happened?
Yeah, basically for, like, a few years now, there's been these really fierce battles over representation and diversity in young adult fiction. And Kat Rosenfield wrote a piece for Vulture called something like YA fiction, YA Twitter's toxic callouts or something. If you Google Kat Rosenfield, who's a great writer, and something YA related, you'll pick it up. That's like the piece on this. But the short version is, because of, some legitimate diversity and representation issues that are, I think, not unique to YA fiction, but to publishing in general. It's just like, it's a harder field to break into if you're poor than certain other fields. And especially in the States, poverty and race are correlated. So you end up having more white books, white editors, white publishers. But this sort of toxic strain of piling onto books before they even come out has emerged. And recently, in a couple of cases I've written about, books got unpublished that were basically about to be published because people spread online rumors about them supposedly being racist. There's always like a lot of misinformation and uncertainty because people will join in the pile-ons because they don't want to be on the wrong side of it on the basis of very limited information. So it's another community that doesn't handle rumors well. And as seems to happen whenever I write about anything, this sort of slightly bullying people who tend to spearhead these charges, they're now mad at me. So one of them, they've decided I'm a white supremacist. One of them, I'm a very liberal Jew, but yeah, one of the big ones said, I'm similar to Trump and Bannon. And then her agent asked me to take down a tweet criticizing that. It's gotten very weird.
And this was what, because you were critical of the feud, or what was it? Like, why were you? Because
I was critical of sort of this version of call-out culture that's literally getting books unpublished, and because I disagreed with specific claims about books being racism. So it's that thing where if you disagree with a given accusation of racism or transphobia, therefore you must be racist or transphobic. It's like a very toddler-esque black and white way of viewing the world. But yeah, so I ended up writing a couple stories about this. I dedicated like a week worth of my newsletter to just emails from people in the YA community, some of whom are genuinely terrified. Like, published successful YA authors are writing me emails like I'm Oscar Schindler or something. They're like, thank you so much for coming. And it's like crazy because this is just like a relatively small group of people on Twitter. And it's so weird, I think, especially if you're offline, to understand, how sort of online bullying can have such a big effect. And I don't think we have the full answer for why it's had that here, but yeah, none of the published authors will go on the record about how frustrated they are at what's happening. And I think what was saddest is, like, I heard from a bunch of writers who are themselves people of color, and they say when they try to pitch something to a white editor, like, hypothetical example, but if you're black and you want to write a YA book, you'll often be pitching it to a, Ivy League educated white agent or editor. And that editor will tell you need to write more about oppression. Your black character isn't oppressed enough. Or sometimes there's obviously a lot of black or Asian or Indian writers who don't want to write about black or Asian or Indian characters. And they'll be told, no, you should do an Own Voices book. Own Voices is a hashtag of just like an author about an Asian character, a book about an Asian character written by an Asian author is Own Voices. And Own Voices is like really hot and marketable right now, which for understandable reasons. Like, I think it's good to have Jewish narratives by Jewish authors, but at a certain point you want people to sort of be able to write what they're most qualified to write or what interests them the most. So yeah, those stories got to me the most, of sort of white agents telling people of color authors in the name of diversity that they should write about their own racial group or ethnic group. And in some cases this has gotten like so bizarre. Like the most recent one, I'm not sure where it ended up, but people piled on a book. The author is a trans woman with a PhD in cultural anthropology. She's spent years of her life studying the Hijra, sort of third gender basically in India, I think. Because she happens to be white, she was deemed incapable of writing a story about sort of Asian third gender stuff or Indian third gender stuff. It gets to the point where if someone has a PhD in cultural anthropology, I think whatever the color of their skin, they probably are qualified to write about something like that sensitively. Or if they're not, it's sort of like, what's the point of building up knowledge or expertise? What's the point of getting a PhD? So yeah, I'm rambling a little bit, but the point is a lot of the YA stuff just centers on these really essentialist views of race and identity where, again, this one author, she's not a academically talented trans woman who studied this thing really carefully. She's just a white woman. End of story. She's white, so she can't write about this. And another blow up involved a black author who wrote about the Kosovo War, but he's black, so he's not familiar with that culture, so he can't write about that. It's just not. If literature followed these rules or publishing followed these rules, books would be boring as hell. I wouldn't want to read them.
Yeah, so it's like enforcing identity politics on people in like a pretty rigid way.
Yeah, I try to use the term identitarianism rather than identity politics because, like, I
Okay.
think I try to push for that distinction. Maybe words don't matter anymore because it's online, so everyone just rails about everything. But like to me, feminism is a form of identity politics. It's a group with like common interests coming together and advocating for them. To me, identitarianism is this separate ideology that just like you're a woman, so you can write about these things. You automatically have certain forms of knowledge. It takes like these kernels of common sense. It's like obviously as a woman you do know certain things more than most men. You know what it's like to be a woman, but it blows that up to where your identity is sort of like you're not Megan, you're a white woman. That's it, and that restricts you and essentializes you in certain ways.
And you can't possibly relate to people who don't share your precise identity.
Right. Which when what's so crazy about that is that's the entire point of literature is like getting people to relate to. You read Philip Roth and you can sort of get what it's like to be a neurotic middle class Jew in New Jersey or whatever. I'm glad we have that. I would hate for that's the whole point of literature.
So I had wanted to talk to you about, well, there's a bunch of other things I should talk to you about, but the way that journalists have responded to you, like when journalists are criticizing you, this frustrates me so much because it's like obviously people say all sorts of bullshit online. Like people are going to attack you, say all sorts of things. There's lots of people who are anonymous, so aren't accountable online, so they can say whatever they want. There's lots of people who are just activists and whatever. But when journalists are responding to you and criticizing you and not criticizing you fairly, I mean, I feel like that's like a pretty big deal because I feel like it's significant of something more. I feel like it's significant of something happening in journalism where reporters and journalists are not, so invested in being, in fact checking and being accurate, and being, relative. Not that I believe that anyone is truly unbiased, but journalists are supposed to like aspire to be unbiased in a way to report fairly. Yeah, like what's happened to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had some frustrating experiences in that department. I think I don't know. I'm sort of more interested in developing a general theory because I'm worried about it, not just for me, but for journalism. And I think I came. I don't know if I came up with this idea or sort of repackaged other people's thinking, but if you imagine that there's one set of norms about writing and discourse called accuracy norms, where the general goal is to get things right and to treat sort of falsifiable statements as something to be proven or disproven. Then there's right side norms, where you view any conflict as like, who's on the right side of it and how can I show I'm on the right side of it? In my view, a lot of journalists are sort of shifting toward right side norms, and it worries the hell out of me because I think you're sort of delegitimizing journalism itself. There'll always be activists, there'll always be press flacks, there'll always be hackish people who are ideologues at heart. Journalism is one of those few types of thinking where you're supposed to like try to remove yourself from that a little. And I've never conceived of that as like, to be a journalist, I have to forget the fact that I'm in favor of like way more redistribution or that I'm pro-gay marriage and all that stuff. But it's just more for an individual thing. Can you look into it and try to ascertain whether it's true? So with the Zucker Clinic, the right side, the activists, said stuff that wasn't true. And it's weird to me when journalists, would act like there's anything wrong with pointing that out. Because you're putting yourself out of business there. Journalists need to be able to look into stuff and decide whether it happened or not. And Covington's another good example because whatever you think about what happened, early on, certain claims about what happened were false. Just that the kids sort of surrounded the native activists and sort of bullied him in a certain way. I watched those videos. Again, I'm not sort of litigating the whole MAGA hats versus native activist thing, but it's very obviously the case that he walked into the group and that the original narrative was false. And it was weird to me and troubling to see so many journalists sometimes not just back down from false claims, but double down on them. And I think it's a combination of the election of Trump was such a catastrophe that people have gone crazy a little bit in very understandable ways, and they've gotten more ideological, and they've realized like conservatism really poses a threat to the fabric of the United States, which I agree with. That plus social media, where the incentives are very different, and you can get piled on for being the one person who stands up and says like, "No, the video shows something different happened." It's crazy to me to see people in their 30s and 40s like respond to, someone will say, "It looks like Phillips walked into the group," and they sort of folded it around him rather than that they approached him and surrounded him. For a 30 or 40-year-old to respond to that like, "Oh, so you're on his side now, you're on their side now, you're siding with the MAGA hats," well, just quit your job, give your job to someone who actually wants to be a journalist and is interested in figuring out the truth. That's not journalism, and it's something you'd expect of like a middle schooler. So I do see more and more of that. I'm aware of at least two cases where um, journalists had HR complaints at major publications leveled against them, basically for saying or writing stuff that was well within the mainstream, but that made other people in the organization feel unsafe or uncomfortable. I'm not talking about like race science here. I'm talking about centrist to center right views. Uh, I'm sort of worried that there's like cops sort of infiltrating journalism, like the sort of people who don't agree and disagreement and seeking the truth, but just want to punish people. I can't tell you like how common it is, because luckily most of my friends are sort of nerdy public policy and nonprofit types, not journalists, which is better. But this stuff really worries me, and I think anyone who cares about journalism should be worried about it. I also do think a lot of editors recognize this, and there's a little bit of a backlash to it, but I'm not sure people understand how crazy things are getting in certain outlets and the demands being made by people who are cops rather than journalists.
And I mean, I guess, yeah, and I think that something, I mean, you've had this kind of ongoing, I want to say feud, but I also don't want to position it as like a two-sided thing with
Yeah.
a trans activist named Caitlin Burns, who I think works for Reality Check.
No, Rewire News.
Rewire, right. That's what okay. I knew that actually. And so, and you've contacted Rewire News about this. So, I mean, well, first tell me what's going on. Tell me what happened. Tell me what Caitlin is accusing you of.
Yeah. I think there's some details I'll leave out, but like she contacted my employer at one point. I contacted hers. It's been this horribly ugly thing, stemming from her claims years ago now that I psychologically bullied her into an interview, that I DM'd her inappropriately. I was lucky because like I have all these chat logs and none of it happened. She now I feel like a middle schooler. Like she did it first. Like she DM'd me first. She said personal stuff that I didn't want to hear about. Yeah, it's sort of taken on this weird rumor aspect where like a lot of mainstream journalists are just spreading these professionally damaging rumors, even though I've posted whatever I can post showing that they never happened. Whereas like she'll say X happened, I'll post an email or a chat log showing like, no, the opposite of X happened. So, I don't want to personalize this, but this is an example of what I mean, where people like journalists just jump on whatever the latest outrage is. And there's always going to be people who do that. Like, whatever, Twitter will always be a nightmare, but to see journalists sort of care so little about the truth and what really happened. And again, like you asked me about that case, I'm happy to answer, but not just with this, with Covington, with Zucker, with anything else. Like it's just not a good trajectory for journalism, and it's a good environment for people who make stuff up or who have agendas and who are willing to be dishonest. Because like if you say something attention-getting and accusatory online with a certain moral valence to it, people will pick up your claim and run with it without checking it. It's going to cause issues in the long run. It's a really new approach to, I guess, to epistemology almost, to like figuring out what's real. And again, it's human nature, but journalists should not do that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a tough one because in cases like that, it's like, if somebody claims that they're being harassed, then you don't want people to be harassed and you want to support people who are being harassed. And we're currently going through this whole Me Too thing, for example, where it's like women are coming out about situations and assaults and harassment that they felt like they couldn't talk about before because, you know, they lose their job or whatever. But at the same time, it's like anybody can say anything online. And especially if journalists, I mean, if everybody's just going to be like, oh, well, they said it, so it must be true. But especially if journalists are going to be like, well, they said it, it must be true, and refuse to investigate or just literally ignore facts that are presented to them. I mean, we really can't do that. Like, and it's tough because there's, you know, this mantra, not that it only happens with women, but there is the mantra of like, believe women.
Yeah.
At the same time, sometimes people say things that aren't true. And how do we navigate that?
Yeah, and I also think believe women, which is a good guideline, started in the case of women reporting real rapes in real life not being believed. Yeah. And you think about what it's I've had exes who have been sexually assaulted. I'm sure most men have. And in one case when I was younger, I'm slightly ashamed of this, but I sort of I pressured her a little bit to report it because she'd been groped by a taxi driver. And I was too young. I didn't understand what it means to report something. It didn't end up being like a traumatic experience to her. She talked to a cop, and that was that. They never found the guy. But it's a big deal to report a sexual assault. Like, Jesus Christ, the amount of scrutiny you're opening yourself up to.
It's a huge ordeal.
Yeah. And I feel I should have handled that differently. And I think 35-year-old Jesse would have handled it differently than 25-year-old different. It was like this very male thing where I was so sort of furious on her behalf. And this happened too when a friend of mine said she was sexually assaulted by an editor at work. Not assaulted, harassed. I was just like, report him. And I think it's easy for men who don't have to face the repercussions of that to just be very justice minded and like, you know, we want to protect women or whatever. Whereas for a woman, deciding whether to report is like a big deal. You could be throwing your whole life into turmoil. Mm-hmm. All of which is a long-winded and much TMI way of saying believe women should not be applied in the exact same way to online bullshit, especially online bullshit where it's just like vague accusations of harassment, where it isn't clear what someone's being accused of. And
and when harassment, I mean, what I was getting at was not like, well, we shouldn't believe women, but more that like that kind of language and those kinds of narratives are being applied to all sorts of situations that are not those situations. Like, we're not talking about sexual assault. And it's like online harassment is used when people like quote tweet somebody or like you reply to somebody and it's like you're abusing them and you're harassing them. And it's
I've seen literal grown ass adults say like, not about me, about other people. Well, you know, he keeps quote retweeting people, so you can tell that's abuser behavior. And it's like, dude, 30 seconds ago, abuser meant someone who was like locking you in your bedroom or raping. Now they're mean online. It's just. Yeah. Well, there's the whole Sarah Schulman conflict is not abuse thing. And I think that's a really big problem in lefty communities now of just this concept creep where like no one can ever disagree. It's always like you are psychologically assaulting me by disagreeing with me. And in social justice communities, it's really bad. I think for people who actually have mental health problems, it probably has like an iatrogenic effect where they spend all day online thinking they're being abused by people who just disagree with them. Mm-hmm. It also makes it harder to take any claims of, like, I hate to say it, but if I'm on Twitter now and I see X is a harasser, I'm like, that's probably not true. And you don't want to build a system where
you just don't believe anyone.
Yeah. Whereas, again, if a woman said X raped me, I would absolutely believe her because it's just such a different, again, not that women never make stuff up, but it's just such a different incentive system. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I went on Twitter tomorrow and I did a tweet storm about you and said, oh, she was harassing me during a Skype conversation, I could immediately get 100 retweets because people want to be mad at you and it's such a egregious story. But yeah, it drives me crazy, just the way harassment's being defined down, especially because like the first time anyone ever read my writing was during Gamergate, where there was some real harassment going on, like death threats. And I've reported on people who got death threats. That's harassment. Harassment is not, you know, I quote retweeted you and then 10 people said you're dumb. That's just being online. You don't have to be online. You don't have to be on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's tough because I sort of wonder if like people do seem to take disagreement really, really personally. And I wonder if this sort of framing disagreement as harassment or abuse, as violence, is sort of playing into that, like where people just I don't know. If people expect not to be disagreed with, and when they are, they take it really personally and experience it as this really hostile thing. When really, if people are disagreeing with you, you really probably shouldn't take it personally, and you should like be like, oh, okay, no, this is not a personal attack. This is we are seeing things differently.
Yeah, I also think like especially when people only hang out with ideologically like-minded people online, like um, there's some trans people who think that if you talk about desistance, you're literally causing trans kids to kill themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some other kinds of activists who say that like if you express a mildly anti-affirmative action position, that is literally white supremacy. That is literally a force that kills people. And it's just this tendency toward catastrophization and the pathologization of disagreement that it's not going to make you a well-functioning adult in the real world once you log off, because in the real world there are a lot of people who disagree with you, and treating these fairly moderate stances as beyond the pale and as literally killing people is just yeah, it's a bad idea. It's a bad time to try to like write about stuff or disagree
Yeah.
with anybody.
Yeah, it's hard. And I mean, like, even, I mean, I've sort of recently been talking to lots of people that I disagree with on various things. I mean, mostly like politically. And I really enjoy it. And I feel like it really humanizes people. Like, obviously, when you talk in real life, but even, doing interviews and stuff like that with people that, don't understand your perspective or don't see things your way, I find it builds understanding. But
Yeah.
I also find that most people that I know, because, I've been I mean, politically, I'm not talking about necessarily my friends in real life, many of whom aren't political at all, but, the people that I know on feminism or people that I know on the left or whatever, really, like, they think that the act of talking to someone that you disagree with or who is on the opposite end of the political spectrum or who doesn't like feminism or whatever it is bad in itself
Yeah.
and somehow taints your politics. And I sort of think the opposite thing, and I find that a really strange position to take, but a lot of people hold that position. Like,
Yeah.
like, I don't know if you're going to get in trouble for talking to me, for example.
Yeah, well, no, and I told you I was a little bit worried about it because like people will be mad at me on Twitter, but like honestly at this point who the fuck cares? I no, that's what people don't realize is like they're sort of the average person at this point is so sick of like the constant screaming on Twitter that there's no incentive for me. Um, the outrage is just sort of so constant and never ending and pops up over nothing that like I don't care anymore. Like those aren't people who read me. They're not people who send me thoughtful emails. So yeah, we disagree on stuff. We disagree on like some of the pronoun and trans stuff, but a lot of people agree with your side of it, and I think we should try to persuade, not act like everyone's Hitler. Although for Twitter purposes, I should conclude this by saying I do think you're Hitler. So,
Just to be clear.
exactly.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for talking with me about all this. I really appreciate it. It's really interesting. And I love your work. I really appreciate your reporting. I think it's great. So even when
Thanks,
I
Megan.
disagree with you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Cool. Have a great day.
You too.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Cool. That was great.